Hi, I'm Dr. Kerry McInerney. Dr. Eleanor Drage and I are the hosts of the Good Robot podcast. Join us as we ask the experts, what is good technology? Is it even possible? And how can feminism help us work towards it? If you want to learn more about today's topic, head over to our website, www.thegoodrobot.co.uk, where we've got a full transcript of the episode and a specially curated reading list by every guest. We love hearing from listeners, so feel free to tweet or email us, and we'd also so appreciate you leaving us a review on the podcast app. But until then, sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode.
In this episode, we talk to Giada Pistilli, principal ethicist at Hugging Face, which is the company that Meg Mitchell joined following her departure from Google. Giada is also completing her PhD in philosophy and ethics of applied conversational AI at Sorbonne University. We talk about value pluralism in AI, which means building AI according to the values of different groups of people. We also explore what it means for an AI company to actually take AI ethics really seriously, as well as the state of feminism in France right now. We hope you enjoyed the show.
Thanks so much for joining us here today on what is a very gloomy day in London and Cambridge. It looks like possibly a gloomy day on your side as well, but seeing you is very wonderful. It's brightening up our day already. So just to kick us off, can you tell us a bit about who you are, what you do, and what's brought you to thinking about gender, feminism, and technology?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So excited to be here today. So I'm Giada Pistilli. I'm a researcher in philosophy, and I'm wrapping up my PhD in philosophy and ethics applied to conversational AI at Sorbonne University. And I'm also a principal ethicist at Hugging Face, so a platform. And so I work at the intersection between policy, legal, and ethics, and I mainly do research in AI ethics. And we're really focused on everything that's linked to natural language processing, conversational AI, chatbots, virtual assistants. And so, yeah, I've been thinking a lot about how there's also this intersection between race, gender, technology. Of course, we're all aware of bias problem that exists today in technology, especially when it's linked to AI, because we all know that when we have to train an AI model, so we're kind of taking a snapshot of reality. So one of the questions that I will always ask myself is, do we have to represent society as it is today with all its problems, of course, linked to race, gender, misrepresentation, and also there's the problem of overrepresentation and underrepresentation because those models are statistic model. So it's really interesting to ask ourselves the question of, do we have to represent society as it is today, or do we want it to represent the society that we wish it was, like in the near future, in 5 years, 10 years? So I think that it's not really a question that we ask ourselves too often, because of course we all come from different sets of values. So I really have also focused on value theory in my research. And so, yeah, I think it's interesting to kind of find a good balance between what we want to represent. And I'm really focused on use case application, because every time I also talk about ethics, I say that, and this is kind of my theories and hypothesis, that we have different time frames where we can apply ethics to AI. And so we have mainly this huge pipeline of AI development. And so we could apply ethics at the very beginning and the very bottom. So it would be like the development. So there's where we talk about bias, discrimination, overrepresentation, and representation. And it's also linked to language, of course. Since I work on conversational AI, this is one of my main focus. And this is super true, especially when we talk about minority languages. So underrepresented languages, such as we all know that are really interesting in collectives and associations, such as Masakane or other also protecting the Maori language. And so it's really interesting to focus on that. And then we also have the very end of the pipeline where it concerns the deployment phase. And so I think we would need two different analyses, especially philosophical and ethical analysis, to kind of see if we're going to focus more on the development phase and then thinking about data sets, et cetera, architecture, of course, too. And then we have the use case application where we're mainly focused on then accessibility, transparency as well, explainability, and really the users. And those users, of course, are humans. So it's really important to refocus on the humans.
Fantastic. Thank you. You are principal ethicist at one of the most exciting ethical AI companies around at the moment. And we've been following the launch of Hugging Face since Margaret left Google. And it's kind of, to me, like one of these organizations like DARE, which is Timmy Gabru's organization, that sprang up from people who had a really tough time in big tech and were either dismissed on really unfair grounds or bullied out. So what attracted you to Hugging Face? And can you tell us a little bit more about the company, what it stands for, and how it was conceived?
Absolutely. So I think you're 100% right. We have lots of people coming from big tech and then wanted to work, I would say, more of a human level company, right? So dealing with the same. So we're talking about AI, which is this kind of really crazy universe and really crazy technology that goes at really fast. So I think it's also important to refocus on the humans, as we were saying. And I think Hugging Face what does best is we're focusing around humans. So people that work there, our community, since we're community driven, and that's really what attracted me. As I was saying, I'm really interested on the users. So it's really important to also go talk to people who use and are developing and deploying those kind of technologies. And the one also really important thing is that, of course, we're also value driven. And so that's also what really attracted me. And so how did that happen? Actually, I was working at Big Science. So it was this open science project. And it was really overwhelming at the beginning because we were over 1,000 researchers. We wanted to develop underrepresented languages. So we really wanted to be a project that focused on multilingualism. And so from there, and also having a really grounded like data governance approach, having this first experience also with Hugging Face, I had the chance to meet Meg, Yassine, and other incredible people that work there. And I led the drafting of the ethical charter of the project. And then from there, they actually asked me like 6 months after if I wanted to consider job opportunities at Hugging Face. And I was really excited because kind of like a dream team. And especially knowing, I think, of course, I mean, I don't have like 15 years of experience working in tech. I have like, let's say 5-6 years. But it's really rare, I would say, to deeply care about the people that work in your company and given a particular attention about diversity and inclusion. So we have, of course, people dedicated to work on that. This is linked also to race, gender, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it was super important for me to work in a company where they think about these questions and they really try to inform everything they do based on the values that we share, also knowing that, of course, we all have different sets of values. So I think what they liked about me and what I liked about them is that I have this deeply focused on value pluralism and the respect and acknowledging that there's no one who's superior to other ones or one who's right and one who's wrong. But we all have this really big community where also, of course, the ML and AI community is also involved. So this is kind of a sharing, giving and taking that really attracted me.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, it's so great to see some of these companies emerge. And I just hope that there's lots of other really ethical, really exciting pro-justice AI companies that spring to life in the coming years. So can you tell us then, to you as someone who sits in an organization that actually makes AI, what is good technology? Is it even possible? And how do your feminist values help you work towards it?
I think that's the most important question, because especially when we're doing ethics. So I think that coming back to my kind of analysis where we have this huge pipeline, this kind of value chain also of AI development and deployment, I think it's really important to consider both of them and to have a really focused analysis, so ethical analysis that apply to both of them. And I think we can't have, and that's probably, at least from my perspective, the kind of lack that we have today also in the broader AI ethics community is that we usually tend to think about those two analyses kind of separately. And sometimes we instead just focus on the development phase. And so, of course, we go deep dive into, considerations about bias, inclusion, accessibility, but just from maybe a data set and the training data point of view. Maybe sometimes also kind of forgetting what those technologies are for. And so I think it's really important to refocus on asking the good questions. And then from there, at least my approach is not only having a kind of a risk-based approach where we try to anticipate all the risks that are associated to a specific technology, but also trying to lead by example. So I think it's really important when deploying an AI model or system, it's really important to also give in good examples. Just, I don't know, I've deployed this really interesting machine translation model. Here's how we use it, and here's what you can actually use it. And so it's really important to say, those are the limits, those are the intended uses, and that's how you can actually make a good use. So I think good technology or good AI needs to be linked to a good use, and it can be just isolated in its own kind of universe where it doesn't get in touch with any people.
That's so fascinating. And I really love the way you frame it as saying, like, yes, it's important for us to think about the risks of technology, but that's very much the bare minimum. And there's so much more that companies can be doing to model, try to develop good technologies that themselves generate good practices. And I also really loved hearing about your reflections on Hugging Face as well in one of our previous episodes with Sarah Franklin. So for our listeners, definitely go check that out. Sarah talks about the way that good technology starts with good and ethical research cultures, and that, if you don't have those good cultures, like, you don't necessarily have a space where people are going to be asking those critical, probing, constructive questions that really need to be asked at all these different stages from development to deployment. But I wanted to ask you a little bit more in detail about what this kind of looks like for you on the ground day to day, because you're in a really interesting kind of linchpin position where you're bringing together ethical and legal and technical expertise and having to try and find ways of bridging these three areas. So what's that like? How do you manage to balance all those different kinds of sometimes competing concerns?
Yeah, well, of course, first things first, I'm not alone doing that. I have an amazing team who really deserves to be on the spotlight as well. And I think it really takes a village to do also great work. And it couldn't be done without the help of my research scientists that work with me, the tech consultants who work with me, policy directors, everyone. So all my colleagues are really fundamental to this work. We recently published one of the joint work that we did together, especially linked to, we use as a use case example, the Big Science Project, since this is where we really started working all together. And so I completely agree. Everything starts when thinking about good technology, about what it could be also called kind of an ethical framework, which is also my specialty, I would say, for now. So what we wanted to show is that it was really important to think about ethical frameworks, but not standing them alone, because of course they can be interesting. They can kind of frame. It's always a starting point to reflect also ahead about the risks, as we were saying, but also what we want to project and what we want this technology to be and how we want it to be used. And so grounding on values, I think it's one of the most important things to do at the very beginning. And then from there, the same values can inform other tools. There could be legal tools, there could be also technical tools. So I briefly mentioned model parts. They're of course part of this kind of an analysis framework that we wanted to draft. And then there's also legal tools that are, I don't know if you're familiar about rail licenses, for instance. It means responsible AI licensing. And so those are supposed to be open science licenses, but with an annex where you can have use restrictions. And so those same use restrictions are usually informed by the values that have been put forward by an ethical charter. So it's huge and really interesting movement where those values going for also different disciplines, especially in the AI governance framework, where everything could be defined as being stronger together, meaning that every time we want to put forward an AI system or an architect, then it's interesting to stand and start by setting up those values that are going to inform in this kind of circle. So legal tools and also technical tools. And so in this kind of really big movement, it's interesting to see how those same values are starting to be operationalized, because of course, one of the main, I would say, critics about ethical frameworks is that sometimes they're too general. They're too stuck in theory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think hearing your perspective on this is so interesting because I feel like something Eleanor and I often are really working to do is to try and do this translation work between people who maybe work in different fields but actually have a lot of common ground and want a lot of similar things, but might best be working in different lexicons. Jeffrey Hinton, this kind of very large figure in neural networks and machine learning, came to give a talk at Cambridge a couple of weeks ago. I can't remember the exact date now. And, it was really interesting to hear his perspectives on AI safety. But, something that I think caused quite a lot of controversy, certainly among people in our field, was thinking about his response to questions to do with interdisciplinarity and saying, oh, well, the only way you can understand a brain is if you build it yourself. And this definitely made me a bit sad because I feel like I spend a lot of time defending engineers to other people in the AI ethics community and saying, this isn't representative of how engineers think, this kind of mindset of there's only one way to know. I think there's, such a growing kind of nuanced appreciation of some of these issues. And I think, having companies like Hugging Face modeling different ways of doing this is really important.
We spend a lot of time talking about tech and a lot of time talking about values in relation to technology, but sometimes we don't talk about feminism on its own or activism on its own. What grounds the ideas that we come up with at work when we think about technology? So you have a lot of interest and a lot of involvement in activism in Paris. It's its own particular thing, right? And I lived in Paris for some years and I absolutely love it. And it has its own politics and set of concerns. So can you just tell us a little bit what's going on with feminist activism in Paris? Where's it at?
Yeah, so full disclosure, I've been way more active before COVID and after COVID. I don't know if it's also just my impression, but I fear that lots of specific political movements are kind of drained out. Of course, not talking about the strikes, not talking about the same things, same old or French culture as well. But yeah, so what's super interesting about feminism here in France, especially linked to activism, is that it's really fragmented. I don't know if it's the same elsewhere, but it's really such a pity to see that when joining, it's super hard to join forces and it's really hard to kind of agree on common important things where we stand. And so last time I checked, they were still really pretty fragmented. And there's also this really important value here called secularism. But just long story short, is that it also has been kind of manipulated by the far right and also conservatives, where since the secularism interpretation of French people, at least French culture, is that no religious symbols are allowed on the public space. Unfortunately, this also means that Muslim women and Muslim trans women, because of their religion, because of their religious symbols, then we have all those misunderstandings and the common fight, I would say, kind of that shadow ban. And it's really, since I'm not French, I'm Italian. And so, of course, we also have a really complicated relationship with secularism because we call ourselves secular, but we're not. But I think it's such a pity to kind of forget what's important about feminism. And so, at least that's what I experienced. And I was part of what it's called more radical feminist, where of course, Muslim women were allowed. But I was a minority at that time. And I'm talking especially between 2019, 2020. I really have to be honest. I don't know how it is at the moment, but maybe it's surprising, but feminist movements are not that strong here in France. And despite maybe what someone could believe. So yeah, I think it's mostly linked to their history and their relationship with religion.
a shame how those debates around laïcité or secularism in France and feminism are kind of unchanged since when I was first learning about this stuff as a high school student. We've had a series of quite similar leaders in France that have done very little to move this debate on. I was also talking to you before about how, and this is a problem everywhere, of course, feminists who are feminists on paper have difficulty being feminists in real life or kind of enacting that feminism. And of course, nobody's perfect. We all hopefully do our best. But this is an experience I had in Bologna when I was doing my PhD in a department full of women, and they had worked really hard to get to the positions that they had got to get tenured and really slammed the door behind them. They were really mean. And it very much reminded me of Sarah Ahmed. She talks regularly about feminists on paper and feminists in practice. So what's your experience of that in Paris?
Yeah, so coming from a very conservative also university, because also we have to say that, of course, the philosophy department at Sorbonne is amazing. You had really amazing teachers, but the institution, because it's a really old institution coming from the 13th century, and they're really attached to or their importance, history, blah, blah, blah. Also, and I mean, coming also from the philosophy department, which is usually really much populated by women and also trans women. I mean, we were not that many when I started. We were 40 people, but it was really diverse. But all our women teachers and professors, you could really see that they worked really hard, maybe extra hard to be in the position when they were. But because they work so hard to get where they are, then they want other women to work extra hard to be at the place where they are at the moment instead of helping each other. And so I had some unfortunate experiences with some of them, but I hope this is going to change with next generations. And I completely agree about activism. And I also want to highlight the importance of really rooting for other women, because sometimes we say it out loud, but in practice, we don't really do that. We could be our worst enemies. And that's really sad. That makes me really sad because we already have all the problems that we were aware about. And especially in the tech world, which is really male dominant, but also in academia. I want to say I'm surprised about your experience in Bologna, but I'm not that surprised because once again, as you were saying, we're really, it's really easy to say that we're feminists and we're doing lots of stuff and we are supporting each other, but sometimes it's not really the case. And so I hope that future generations are going to be more empathetic and more supportive also of each other. And actually makes me think about the language question. I don't know if it's like something that English speakers have because you have a non-gendered language. But here in France, there was this huge debate about should we have inclusive language? And actually, of course, feminist movements were really rooting for that. And then at the end of the day was, I think 2 or 3 years ago, at the beginning, they decided that there wasn't an issue. There was a non-issue, as to say in French, and a non-sujet. And so we got all shocked because even conservative universities such as Sorbonne, they were actually using for their official communications. And also lots of my professors, they were using inclusive language. And so the final decision from the academic process came out as a really big shock. And so there was also manifestations at the moment. And like, it's kind of sad to acknowledge the fact that we have to encounter the very unfortunate and unhappy episode to kind of gather around something. But at least there was this youth movement as well. And actually, I think 6 months ago or a year ago, they decided to come back to that decision. And now they're still reevaluating if they want to make it real, this inclusive language. But when, of course, the first decision came out, no surprise, it was all white, old dude. So it's the same story all over again, why we should be the ones deciding for our own language, and especially saying that language don't carry values and don't carry social construct. I'm sure we can agree that that's not true. So I hope that in the really near future, we also have stepped forwards in that direction as well.
And just really quickly, language is, I know, a big deal everywhere, but the French take it really seriously. I mean, the fact that people will protest over language, it doesn't happen everywhere. And it's super important because the Académie Française is this building, literal building on the banks of the Seine, and it's very beautiful, it's very grand, it's sort of curved on both sides, and it's there where the integrity of the French language, and here I have many, inverted commas, is defended according to this bunch of people who protect the French language. They are the guardians of it. They are the gatekeepers of French language. But what's amazing about French is that it so exceeds, like every language, it exceeds the boundaries of this protective force, because people speak, Verlan, this mixture of Arabic and French and many other influences. French is heavily creolized throughout the world. You've got these amazing writers like César and Edouard Glissant that have played with the way that French has been integrated into different ways of speaking. And French is this enormous colonial force, and the destructive force of the French language is still used to impose power over Vietnamese communities. There's this unbelievable, horrific document that I found while doing my PhD that said that, I think it was written in 2007, which is really recent, that talked about the authority of the French language and how it was still being used and should be used to influence elites in Vietnam. So this is a massive issue. And for those of you who think we've gone completely off topic, large language learning models rely on language in order to function. There's huge debates over which languages and how language should be developed in large language models. So this is a really important conversation, because these tools are not just being developed in English, but should also reflect the way that people speak, both within languages and between languages. What about bilingual conversations? What about conversations where people move between two different languages? I have a ton of friends who speak not just in one language, but will constantly flicker between languages. So how is that represented in these tools that we are building?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And on a, much less intellectual side note than, your really interesting exploration of this, Eleanor, as someone who is, I would say, bilingual and, has done a lot of work in French and English and really thought deeply about these questions of translation and sort of multilingualism. I will say I'm always really intrigued / slightly scathing whenever there are novels, whenever it's like a character who's kind of meant to be like multiracial or, existing in multiple language worlds, but then the alternate sort of the non-English language, all they ever say is things like my love or like mother, although like to me, as someone who grew up in a kind of multilingual household, a very strange use of how these different languages might actually be used. Like definitely the only things I can say in like Cantonese or Fijian are like things that are usually very rude, because they're things that like my mom didn't want other people to understand. So I can only have a very mean conversation with people. I think these issues around power and language are so central to the discussions we're having right now about AI ethics and large language models. And for our listeners, I definitely encourage you to check out some of the other fantastic episodes we have on this topic. We have one with Meg Mitchell, which I'll link in the show notes, and also one with David Adlani from Masakana, the organization that Giada mentioned earlier in the episode. But I want to come back, I guess, to this question that we started off with, which was around thinking about kind of feminism in practice, thinking about the relations we have with each other. Because I'm definitely really in agreement with you here, in that the older I get, the less interested I become in people's kind of stated feminist commitments, even though I think those are very important, and the more interested I become in just like how they treat people and how they exist in relation to other people. But I want to ask you about one particular kind of existing relation, which is thinking about women-only spaces, right? And for Eleanor and I, this very much is a trans-inclusive understanding of women, and, it's very distressing the way that sort of woman as a category is being used to enact so much violence. But I know that this is something that you guys have explored at Hugging Face, and was wondering if you could share your experiences of them.
Yeah, sure. So also talking about safe spaces, I guess. So we had this really big conversation about, so full disclosure, we are 100% remote company. So we also, of course, have offices, but most of the conversations that we have happen on GitHub or on Slack, which is our workplace. And so, of course, coming back again to communication and language, it's really important to have one inclusive language. So we have our DEI and people that are really, really deeply caring about the way we speak. It's trying to evolve, especially coming from myself. It's not my first language, English. So I always try and learn new things every day to be more inclusive and to be more respectful of everyone. And so they're really pedagogic, I would say. So this is really amazing. But also coming back to the women, so the women topic, we had this really long conversation about if we should or not have our only women channel Slack, which is also private, and also coming, of course, for people who don't identify themselves as being women. And so we started having one where we were discussing lots of stuff, also kind of sensitive stuff, also lots of, unfortunately, and it's really sad, but lots of my colleagues also experience like people asking them if they're old enough to have, I don't know, interviews with journalists. And we're never cited, especially our comms lead, Brigitte. She's also a woman, and she was just noticing it actually happened just a couple of weeks ago or a week ago. And she was like, that's funny. Every time I try to suggest like one of our male colleagues, nobody asks them if they're, I don't know what's their age and what's their expertise. They just acknowledge the fact they're a man and they're good to go and they do interviews. But sometimes when she tries to suggest our women colleagues, then she had sometimes journalists saying, okay, but what's their expertise and what's her age? And so we were like, if she works here and she already has the expertise, why do we care if she's 21, 26, 35, 35? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. It's important to have this kind of a safe space where we can also talk about our frustrations and sometimes things that we encounter. Like I have one foot in academia and one foot in the companies. And so, and also my other women colleagues, we experience something like when, I don't know, giving conferences and having those really older male colleagues bringing you down or saying that you don't have, once again, the right expertise. And of course, we all suffer of this kind of imposter syndrome, which is super sad. And I don't really see it that often in our male colleagues, not only admin-based, of course, I'm talking about broader colleagues. And so, yeah, I think we had this discussion, I think 6 months ago or a year ago, where we wanted to be private. So at least we could like really exchange tips and be really supportive of each other and say, okay, that's what happened at that conference. And I feel really bad. I think it happened less than a year ago where I was at this conference and then talking about super intelligence. And then we should focus on more concrete like dangers such as discriminations and climate change and et cetera, et cetera. And there was this male philosopher colleague who actually stopped me and interrupted me and said that I was being responsible, that it was in the way of doing philosophy, that we should all be focusing on existential risk and super intelligence, blah, blah, blah. And so I got so angry that I also kind of shared the information with my colleagues, and they were all very supportive and saying, because of course, when it happens, you feel so isolated, you feel so stupid, and you feel like, okay, maybe I'm the one who's wrong, and you start questioning everything. And so, yeah, getting back to Hugging Face, I think it's really important to have this kind of safe space where we can share frustrations and giving each other tips, and how sometimes it could be really easy, like, okay, next time you should just answer that, or be more confident about yourself because you deserve it. You did amazing work. And so I think it's amazing to have this kind of space where you can share everything.
Totally. Thanks so much for bringing that up. And it's easy for women to seem mean to men. We always seem like we're being mean. And then someone will say exactly the same thing as a guy, and people will be like, yeah, that seems really reasonable. So it's just desperately unfair. And I really like the way that you're talking about these female spaces, because it's something that seems to have been left behind in the separatist lesbian fantasies of science fiction or whatever. But all these beautiful, oh gosh, have you been to the Hampstead Heath, the ponds, the ladies' pond at Hampstead Heath? No, there's these kind of special, like, women only zones. But it seems to be something that has really gone out of fashion. Or like men have moaned about being excluded as if women only spaces are somehow analogous to or symmetrical, the same as men only spaces. But it's totally an asymmetric history. And those two things cannot be compared at all. There's that argument of like, oh, well, you're excluding men too, because, like that is just such nonsense. It's the most ahistorical reading of what's going on. But anyway, we could talk to you about this for days, but thank you so much for joining us. It was a real pleasure.
It was my pleasure. So thank you for having me.
This episode was made possible thanks to the generosity of Christina Gore and the MacArthur Foundation. It was produced by Eleanor Drage and Kerry McInerney and edited by Eleanor Drage.